Hello and welcome everyone. Assalamu alaikum and good morning. Firstly, I'm so sorry since I couldn't manage uploading the lecture in time. But then, there are certain engagements which are prevalent and they do not let us do things in time. For the week, we'll have to talk about the impact of female captivity narratives in post-colonial America. And then we have to focus on, the female narratives or the women narratives and how they have been assembled or written or composed, and how far have they been the stories of women, how far have they been excluded from the influence of men around them. We'll have to look at all of these things. I'll make sure that I share this voice clip with Umair, along with the important documents and of course the presentation, the slides, and you'll have to go through the slides as well, and the additional or the helping file that I'll have to provide Umair with. So you need to read them, since we are approaching our midterm as well, so we have to be a bit brisk. The female captivity narrative provides a complex view of colonial American history by recounting the experiences of women captured from their colonial homes by Native Americans. So we've already talked about all these things in detail. Who are Native Americans, the Red Indians, and then why were those females taken as captives? Now, male editors, keep this point in mind, male editors, that means men, often family friends or maybe the town ministers, they have assembled and compiled the experiences of female captives. Now, the stories, they basically belong to the female captives or the females, but then those stories, they were compiled by men, and since men were the ones who were actively engaged in the colonialism of America, their stories and their outlook on those stories of females, they have a certain prejudiced kind of an influence on them. So we have to be pretty much aware of this, that there is this sense of prejudice around these stories. Now, Puritan captivity narratives in particular demonstrate conflict between attempts by Puritan ministers to impose a unified religious message in the sagas and the captives' individual experiences, which often contradicted Puritan doctrine. Puritans, I told you, colonialism, it does not occur from nothing. They have, certain agendas and certain messages that they want to share across the world. So for Indians, they had the slogan of civilizing them and educating them, and for the Red Indians over there in America, the colonialists, they wanted to give them this Puritan religion. Now, Puritan doctrine basically did not want anybody to be imposed with a certain ideology of religion. It does not allow for colonialism, but then this was a certain kind of a contradiction, because this was a pretension on the basis of which these white Europeans, they went over there to America and they made certain places their colonies. During the early colonial era, the ministers' attempts to promote the Puritan covenant conflicted with the individual salvation testimonies of the female captives. In later narratives, where white male editors attempted to impose white cultural values on the female stories, while the captives' experiences reflected acculturation and integration into Indian society. Now, this is a pretty much, a relevant concept. There is this concept that is known as multiculturalism, or what we call hybridity in post-colonial literature. Those captives which were taken by the Red Indians or the Native Americans, those females, they integrated with the people, because when you are being taken as a captive by a certain nation or a race, you become one of them, and after some time you adjust to their values. But then when the stories were written, the stories were compiled by other males, they gave them this outlook that those females out there, they were exploited and they were oppressed. They were not allowed to breathe even properly. And this outlook from the male editors and the ministers, it makes those stories pretty much biased, pretty much prejudiced. Moving forward, female captivity narratives played contradictory roles. While they recorded each captive's unique experience, male editors often included their own cultural, moral and religious values in the written work. Now, the male editors, remember, whosoever were the captives, their experiences, I'm sharing those stories with you. Mary Rowlandson was one that we have discussed in the class. Apart from her, there were quite a few other females whose stories have been compiled by men around them, and those stories, they were basically prejudiced in a way because they were composed and compiled by men. Those female captives would come back and they would narrate their stories, and then the rest of them, those men, they would start compiling their stories from male perspective or from the men's perspective. The female captivity narrative, they show so many symbols. They give us so much of information about the culture of the Red Indians, about their beliefs, about their creeds, about their food, about their carnivals, about their culture. But then all those values, they have been dominated because they themselves did not write the stories. Rather, the ones who were their masters in a practical life, they write those stories. For example, I'm going to give you an example of this colonialism from India. That those people from England, they came over here, they conquered us, and then they started writing stories about us, and within those stories and novels and narratives, they did not say anything about our culture, and even if they would say it with a negative mind and mindset. The meaning they would want to disseminate was fairly negative meaning. For example, we were shown as barbaric, we were shown as ancient, we were shown as uncivilized and unethical, we were shown as believing in magic, believing in certain mythologies, we were shown as non-practical people or unpractical people. Exactly the same way the Red Indians out there in America, they were shown as barbaric, they were shown as the ones who do not fear God or who do not have any stable belief. Developments in historical scholarship on female captivity narratives demonstrate efforts by historians to consider the perspectives of colonial Americans as well as Native Americans. More emphasis on identifying the voices of the female captives in works edited by males reveals the strong influence of male editors conflicting with the determination of female captives to tell their own stories. Now, logically, this has to happen this way, that the ones who were captives, they needed to write their own stories because they were the ones who had the real experience. But then their experiences, they were been translated or composed or compiled by others, specifically males. And males, since they were engaged in a war within the colony, they had, a pretty much partial and prejudiced attitude towards the Americans. 19th century American writers John Greenleaf Whittier, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and then Henry David and Sarah Joseph, all of them they come up with the re-evaluation of Hannah Duston's Captivity saga in prose and poetry. Whittier's work, The Mother Revenge, is written for entertainment and to preserve the legend of Duston's escape. Hawthorne's The Duston Family illustrates strong criticism of Duston's violent escape and traces her desire for revenge to the murder of her infant. And then Thoreau's piece comes from his work A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, and describes Duston's escape. There are multiple stories and multiple people. One story, it's been re-evaluated and rewritten by multiple people with different perspectives and motives. But all those perspectives and motives, whatever were the purposes, they basically degraded and despised the Native Americans, and they tried to glorify the colonialists. Okay, now the captive's position, female narrative and male identity and royal authority in colonial New England, by Teresa Toulouse, examines how colonial male leaders used the Puritan family captivity narratives to facilitate transformation in cultural identity at the end of the 17th century. Toulouse identifies areas that she feels other historians have neglected, particularly in relation to shifts in political and religious history. There are, multiple captivity narratives where the culture of the Englishmen or their identity, they have been imposed on the Red Indians. Now the parameters and the standards with which these colonialists would approach the Red Indians was that those parameters and standards were pretty much English in nature, and what they did was that they would basically gauge or observe and analyze the Red Indians with the parameters they were set in England. And since these two geographies or these two countries, they're far apart from each other, they're far away from each other, that is why there was this confusion and this chaos going on, that those Red Indians, they do not fall into the category of civilized people, religiously strong and suitable people, and they have their own problems, which do not make them able or suitable to live a peaceful life out here in this world. Majority of those captivity narratives, they come out of the experiences of women, because the Native Americans, they considered women to be ideal captives. This is what has been shown to us by these captivity narratives written and developed by men on behalf of the women who were captives. And then women narratives served as a useful tool for promoting Puritan theology. Toulouse, who is basically a writer, identifies a free explanation for the use of female captivity narratives to promote Puritan theology and address threats to the community. Now, there is this point which is a bit logical, that females, since they are pretty much soft, since they are able to extract more philanthropy and sympathy out of the readership, that is why only women's narratives, female narratives, they were promoted firstly. Though it's not that the Native Americans, they've only taken women as hostages, they've taken men as their hostages as well, colonial men. But those stories of men, they were either not published, not shown to the world firstly, or if they were, they became known to the people pretty much later than those female captivity narratives. There was this belief that they wanted to reincarnate into the minds of the people, because those women and their stories, they pretty much symbolize the theology or the concept of Puritanism. If a female generally disseminates some kind of a message that holds a value, and since women, they are considered more innocent than male and men, their voices, they had been heard pretty much more clearly than men. We focusing on Mary Rowlandson's narrative that provides a clear example of the paradoxical roles of Captivity saga. Rowlandson wrote her own narrative but did not publish it until 1682, probably with encouragement and possible assistance from Increase Martha. Rowlandson wrote her narrative with a twofold message. While she testifies that all must repent or face affliction, she simultaneously affirms the redemptive opportunity in her affliction, her captivity. The covenant at the center of Puritan theology plays an essential role in understanding the contradictions in Rowlandson's narrative. According to Puritan doctrine, the covenant depends upon the entire community's adherence to sacred principles. If a single community member disobeyed or lost faith, the entire community suffered. This was basically a Puritan belief. To Puritan ministers, including Cotton Mather, Indian raids reflected punishment for the disobedience of community members. Colonists also interpreted the Indian attacks as punishment for corruption and sin in their communities. Through sermons, Puritan preachers expressed their concern to their communities, and captivity narratives mirror the structure of those sermons. There is another critic who believes that Increase Martha, who transcribed many captive narratives, attempted to impose a uniform theological message in the narratives as a means of bringing the community back to the covenant. The public of Rowlandson's narrative coincided with a decline in the membership in the Congregational Church, and this evidence supports that Increase Martha may have viewed her narrative as a means of promoting traditional Puritan theology and a method of bringing the community back to the church. Puritanism needs to be discussed a bit, since there was this war or conflict going on between Catholicism and Puritanism. Now, the government, the crown, all of them, they wanted to promote Puritanism in one way or the other, and for that specific purpose they have chosen those narratives, because those narratives, they would help people back in England and help people in America as well. They wanted as much people as there could be to enter the covenant of Puritanism and leave Catholicism. Now, there were forced and compulsory diversions with the religions of others. For example, the Red Indians, they were forced to enter Puritanism, and at times that force was shown through these narratives. These narratives, they were written basically with the mind and mentality that these narratives would educate people, more and more people, to enter the covenant of Puritanism. So almost all the female captivity narratives, their stories, they were in one way or other trying to promote and advertise Puritanism to the world, and to the England or the colonist itself. Hannah Duston reflects discrepancies between Puritan theology and her captivity experience within her narrative. She says that Indians attack Haverhill, Massachusetts in 1697 during King William's War and captured Duston and her midwife Mary Neff. While Duston's captivity experience and escape lacked any basis of religious inspiration, Mather incorporated religious themes in his text on her experience to justify Duston's murder of her captors. Duston's escape from her captors lacked any divine inspiration after her Indian captors told her that she would be forced to run the gauntlet. Dustan made her desperate decision. Dustan enlisted captive Samuel Lenderson to help her murder 10 Abenkel and wound another, and she scalped her victims to provide evidence of her exploit to her community. Now, Dustan's captivity narrative, it illustrates the killings of her captors, the Red Indians. But then this Mathur, who is basically supposedly, or who is the person who has assembled and compiled almost all the female captivity narratives, this person has injected quite a few religious themes, Puritan themes, into her narrative as well. Now, Dustan indirectly justifies her killing of the captors because she says that she was there for a prominent message of Puritanism, but then that message was either misunderstood or in whatever way it was taken, but she was taken as a hostage, and for her escape she had to kill those people because she had certain duties to carry. And those killings, they are justified from the Puritan ideology, and from its perspective that those killings they were done in a way where Dustan wanted to flee or escape. Now, the killings in Puritan theology, be it of any human being, they're forbidden. But then those killings of the captors, they've been tried to justify. In fact, Dustan herself is not the person responsible, but Mathur, who is supposedly the compiler of these stories, he tries to create a certain kind of a scenario where those killings, they've been justified. Now, relations between colonial communities and local Native American tribes evolved over time. Those ties, they were getting better and better with the passage of time, but then the outbreak of conflict between the two often contributed to an increased number of raids on colonial communities. Encroachment of the British onto Indian lands and insensitivity by British towards surrounding Indian communities contributed to the outbreak of King Philip's War. The collaborative efforts of the traditional enemies, Nipmucs and Narragansetts and Wampanoags, is a fight to preserve a Native American way of life, which British cultural practices and materials increasingly overwhelmed. And then the Indian attack on Deerfield, Massachusetts in 1704 demonstrates a culmination of the cultural conflict between local Indian tribes and the colonial communities. All these statements, they have been made in the background because those colonial narratives, female captivity narratives, they try to show the Red Indians as responsible for every conflict and the war and the colonialism. But then the first question is that why did these people go over there, and why did they make them their own colony? And then why were they trying to encroach upon the lands and properties of the Red Indians? And that is exactly the reason why the Red Indians, they started raiding them, attacking the colonialists. And exactly within the same scenario, this King Philip's War, it took place. And then this War of Deerfield or Massachusetts in 1704, it also took place. Then another statement that comes that settlement in hunting depleted natural resources such as beaver, and alliances between European and natives caused conflict with neighboring tribes. There were certain tribes, with colonialists, there is this point that they go to a certain nation, to a certain country, where they take the support of one leading community or tribe, and with the help of that one leading community, then they try to subordinate and dominate the rest of the communities as well. And that was exactly the reason why this internal outbreak and conflict took place. So this King Philip's War then affected the English settlement at Deerfield as well as the native inhabitants. Over half of the village adult males died in the battle. majority of the captivity experience during the colonial period came from women. The Native Americans considered women to be ideal captives. This also been claimed. And then several families they suffered because those female captives, including Mary White Rowlandson and Elizabeth Hanson, recorded or allegedly recorded their own experiences. Many female captives, including Hannah Duston and Mary Jamieson, dedicated their stories to a male editor. Each captive experienced captivity uniquely, and their narratives create a complex picture of intercultural relations and tensions. Now, concluding all those narratives, I'm going to let you know in a fairly easy way that Rowlandson's story, it depicts a pretty much complex picture and scenario. She does not clarify that who were basically responsible for all the conflicts and raids that took place. She does not clearly say whether the Red Indians they were responsible or the colonialists they were responsible. But what she tries to indicate is that though the colonialists they did something wrong, but it has not been pinpointed or highlighted within the story. But the reaction that's been followed from the Red Indians or the Native Americans, she partially or indirectly hold them responsible for everything. Then she says that when she was taken over there, she does not necessarily talk about the treatment she received from the Red Indians or the Native Americans, but she merely talks about this Puritan theology time and time again, that whatever is happening, it is basically the wrath of God, Christ. It is because God is unhappy with us. It is because since we are not following religion rigorously or religiously, so the Puritan God basically got us into this conflict. Exactly the same way Hannah Duston's story, it concludes that though Puritan religion or Puritan theology, it does not permit killings, but since she killed her captors, in fact she killed one of them and injured the other one, but justifies them in the face of Puritan theology, saying that she was doing something exalted, something for the sake of God, and in this way if she had to kill those people, those killings they need to be justified. So there are this multiple pictures that we can take out of them, but then there are certain themes that we need to focus on, and it depends on our readings of Maya Angelou's Gathered Together, because she talks about the lost generation and the Jay's movement. And then there is another very good book by this man, Mark Twain, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. If anybody of you have any interest for reading them, he talks about racism and plantation, and then he talks about slavery in America. There is another novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and another one, Gone with the Wind. All of them, they are pretty much good. And they would give you a clear idea, if you read them with a critical mind or a critical approach, what kind of narratives have been written, what kind of literature has been disseminated against the Native Americans. The Native Americans, they've been subjugated both physically and through the literature produced through these captivity narratives. That is all we have for today. I hope